Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? It's a Friday, so we wish each other a guten Erev Shabbos. Shabbos can't come soon enough. We look forward to that rest and refreshing and rejuvenation and recharging our batteries. But first, we have a wonderful daf to share. Page 42, Mem Base. Here in Tractate Sotah, the 18th volume of the Talmud, and today we open Mishnah number 1 of chapter 8. You know, it's interesting, very often in our journey thus far, and what are we, this is episode 1222, right? So there's 2,711 pages. We've done 1,222 pages of the Talmud. So when we reach, right, 1356, something like that, that'll be the halfway point. We're approaching the halfway point. And so many times in our journey, we've encountered digressions, right? The sages get on the topic and they digress, hinging off something related to the topic at hand. And sometimes those digressions are very long. But usually they happen at the level of the Gemara, right? The Mishna is giving the laws that were compiled on the particular subject as they were compiled around the year 200 of the Common Era, redacted in a project organized by Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. So usually the digressions happen in the Gemara, right? Where the Gemara was closed at around the year 500 of the Common Era, and it's these later sages of the Talmud commenting in the Gemara on the earlier discussions that we find in the Mishnah. But here in Tractate Sotah, we've seen that even at the level of the Mishnah, they're going on a pretty extended digression from the topic of the Sotah, the suspected adulteress. I think all of chapter 7 and still in chapter 8, we're hinging off the idea that did the Sotah's warning and oath have to be spoken in the sacred tongue, the holy language of Hebrew? And the answer, no. It's important that she understood what she was being warned about and what she was swearing about during that ritual when the temple was standing. But having asked whether she had to speak and the priest speaking to her, whether that had to be done in Hebrew, then we went off talking about prayer, about the blessings and curses that were read to the Jewish people when Joshua led us into the promised land. Now we've been learning about the Kohen Gadol, right? The high priest on Yom Kippur. When he reads from the Torah, did he have to do that in Hebrew? Yes. When the king read from the Torah to the assemblage of the population at the Hakel, which would happen every 7 years, right after the Shemitah year ended and the Sukkot of the new cycle beginning, the new 7-year cycle beginning, and people would gather in Jerusalem for Sukkot anyway, and then the king would come to the Temple Mount and he would read from the Torah. Did that have to be done in Hebrew? Yes, that had to be done in Hebrew. And now here, chapter 8, we're going to ask again about something that would be a reading from the Torah, passages from the Torah. Did it have to be done in Hebrew? Now the context is the high priest anointed for war. Right, we've learned about that in the Torah. We've heard about this idea before. There's the high priest serving in the temple, officiating, bringing the daily offerings, etc. And when there was a war, to sort of help inspire and lead the people in a holy and justified war, that there would be a high priest anointed to sort of go with the army to the battle and to inspire the troops prior to the battle, and he would share certain passages from the Torah. And did that have to be done in Hebrew? Here we go. So who's with us as we light up the darkness? You were thinking Sal's going to forget. He's going to forget to light the candle. Who's in the house? Yehudit in South Carolina. Joe in Southern California. Sharon in New Jersey. Oh, it skipped on me. Shandora in the Bronx. Jay in Northern Minnesota. Bill in Mid-Missouri. Gordo in Scotland. Checking in from across the pond. Susie in California. Joe in Southern California. Sharon says Shabbat Shalom. Renee says, made it. Guy in Dayton, Ohio. Ella says shalom. Aoife in Florida. Marjorie checking in. Are you in Georgia or in Virginia? And Lynn in North Texas. Welcome, everybody. Okay, let's go. Chapter 8, Mishnah number 1 here in Tractate Sotah. With regard to the priest who was anointed for war, at the time he would speak to the nation, he would speak to them in Lashon Kodesh, in the sacred tongue, Hebrew. As it is stated, quote, "And it shall be, when you draw near to the battle, that the priest shall approach and speak to the people." Deuteronomy 20, verse 2. And by the way, we had the question come up yesterday. When did chapter and verse get established by our sages, right? And the answer is it was very late, and it wasn't established by the sages of the Talmud. It was much later. The Torah was given to Moses in its present form. It has not changed at all since the Torah was given to Moses at Mount Sinai. Some biblical scholars will argue with that, but they're coming from a place of limited information and making a guess. We're coming from a place of a tradition passed down, from teacher to student and parent to child since Mount Sinai, and we attest the Torah that was given at Mount Sinai is the Torah we have today. How is it divided, right? So whenever we have, as here, for instance, the Talmud is referring to the priest reading a section from the Torah. When the sages would refer to a section from the Torah, they would not say Deuteronomy, chapter 20, verse 2. That didn't exist at the time of the sages. They would simply say the first word or the first few words of the passage that we're talking about. And because they had the entire, not just the Torah, they had the entire Bible memorized. And so whenever they would be speaking in the context of the priest anointed for war, reading a passage about that subject, they would immediately know what verses are being talked about just from those first few words. The division of the Torah into weekly portions, so into 54 portions, or it's divided in different ways. But this idea, I think it's 54 parshiot, but the Jewish year is a lunar year, and so some years it's shorter, some years it's longer, right? We have a leap month in 7 of 19 years. At any rate, dividing it into Torah portions, again, that was keyed off the first word of the portions, and that's why the Torah portions are all named after either the first word or almost the first word of the Sidra, right? Of the particular Torah portion we're talking about. And then in some texts, they would say how many verses were included in a particular Torah portion. The idea of chapter and verse came much later, and interestingly, it basically came as book publishing was coming. It was originated by our Christian brothers and sisters so that they could refer to the Bible in their discussions. And sadly, there was a time in history when, that friendship was, let's say, strained between Christians and Jews. Sadly, there were many times that the Christian population of Europe, which was much, much, much larger than the Jewish population, was not kind to the Jews. And one of the forms that lack of kindness took is they would arrange a debate, right? A debate between a Christian Bible scholar and a Jewish scholar of the Torah, of the Tanakh. And the debate, was really meant to convince the Jews that the Christians are right. But in these debates, and the Jews really had no choice but to participate, it's almost like, well, if you win, that's a problem, and so we're going to send a pogrom and a lot of Jews will be killed. And if you lose, well, that justifies that it's a problem. And a lot of Jews were killed, so it's almost like the best outcome was that the poor rabbi who was sent to do the debate, he would get hurt, but the population would be left alone. Very few happy outcomes from those events. But at any rate, our scholars had to be prepared for these debates, And it was much easier, of course, to refer to a particular verse from the Bible with this numerical system. And so we adopted the system as well. The numbered chapters and verses is almost the same, right? Whether you're talking about Christian scholars or Jewish scholars, I think there's some very minor differences. I'm sure Bill is much more of an expert than I am in this subject and could tell us what some of those differences are. But for the most part, it's very similar. The ordering of the books in what Christians call the Old Testament and we call the Bible, a little bit of variance as well. But at any rate, the idea of bringing in numbered chapters and verses was very late in Jewish history. You know, that only happened, I don't know, in the last 500 to 700 years, something like that. And 500 to 700 years ago in Jewish history is recent, right? Recent. Jewish history, very old. All right, at any rate. With regard to the priest who was anointed for war, the time that he would speak to the nation, he would speak to them in the sacred tongue of Hebrew, and he said, quote, and it shall be when you draw near to the battle, or as it is stated, quote, and it shall be when you draw near to the battle, the priest shall approach and speak to the people. Deuteronomy 20, verse 2, this priest identified in the verse is the priest anointed for war, the priest who is inaugurated specifically to serve this function, quote, and speak to the people. He addresses them in the sacred tongue of Hebrew. Now, the Torah dictates what the priest says. Quote, and he shall say to them, hear, Israel, H-E-A-R, listen, right, hear, Israel, you draw near today to battle against your enemies. Let not your heart faint, fear not, nor be alarmed, and do not be terrified of them. Deuteronomy 20, verse 3. And the priest continues, against your enemies and not against your brothers. This is not a war of the tribe of Judah against Shimon, Yehuda against Shimon, and not Shimon against Binyamin, such that if you fall into their hands, your brothers will have mercy on you, as it is stated with regard to the war between Judah and Israel. Quote, and the man that had been mentioned by name rose up and took the captives, and with the spoil clothed all that were naked among them, and arrayed them, and shod them, and gave them to eat and to drink, and anointed them, and carried all the feeble of them upon donkeys, and brought them to Jericho, the city of palm trees, unto their brethren. Then they returned to Samaria. Right, 2 Chronicles 28:15. In other words, the priest is saying to the people, this is not going to be like one of those civil wars, you know, between different tribes of the Jewish people, where even the ones who lose, you know, understand that they're the same family as the ones who won, and they're going to be kind to each other after the battle. Rather, you are marching to war against your enemies, and if you fall into their hands, they will not have mercy on you. So the priest continues, let not your heart faint, fear not, nor be alarmed, and do not be terrified of them. And the Mishna expounds these phrases, let not your heart faint, due to the neighing of horses and the sharpening of the enemy's swords. Fear not, due to the knocking of shields and the noise of their boots. Nor be alarmed by the sound of trumpets. Do not be terrified, due to the sound of shouts. Right? So you're going up against an enemy that will have no mercy on you. Why should you not be afraid, not of their soldiers, nor of their horses, nor of their trumpets, nor of anything that would normally instill fear in the enemies of such a great army as, you know, when the sages of the Mishna are talking about the enemy who we might go to war against, they're talking about the Romans, right? So the most powerful army that had ever existed. Why should we not be scared if we're going up against such an army? And the priest explains, quote, for the Lord your God is he that goes with you to fight for you against your enemies to save you. Right, now the sages are thinking of the Roman army, and that's why they're using imagery from the Roman army. The Torah, where these verses are written, right, is talking to the people, the children of Israel in the wilderness who are going to enter the promised land and drive all the Canaanites and their abominable practices out of the Holy Land. That was a holy war, right, where they were sent, instructed specifically by God to do that. Much later, right? When there was a rebellion, an uprising against Rome, yeah, that did not go well. That did not go well at all. That ended in the destruction of the Second Temple. So if God is with us and we don't have to be afraid of armies more powerful and numerous than we, why didn't it work at the time of the uprising against Rome? Answer, the spiritual level of the people had fallen by then. Now that's me inserting my commentary. But what the sages are talking about here is sort of the general law. Like right when you have a proper holy sanctioned war, where the people's level is where it should be, and they're being sent to war, by God, as it were, or at least through a prophet, etc., then they need not fear. And this is what the priest anointed for war would be saying to them in such a situation. Right, so the Gemara is now, the Mishna is now explaining what the priest, why the priest is speaking this way. Remember that they, your enemy, come to war championed by flesh and blood, and you are coming championed by the omnipresent. The Philistines came championed by Goliath, right? That was a holy and sanctioned war, the war that David led against the Philistines. The Philistines came championed by Goliath. What was his end? Well, in the end, he fell by the sword, and they fell with him. See 1 Samuel chapter 17. The Ammonites came, championed by Shobach. What was his end? In the end, he fell by the sword, and they fell with him. See 2 Samuel chapter 10. But as for you, you are not so. This is the priest would be speaking to the Jewish people. You are not so. You are not relying on the strength of mortals. Quote, for the Lord your God is he that goes with you to fight for you against your enemies to save you. And this verse is referring to the camp of the Ark of the Covenant that accompanies them out to war. And that concludes mission number 1 here in chapter 8. And now you can see why, the concept of the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark, it was a good concept, right? The idea that if they could find this, the Ark of the Covenant, and think of it as a weapon of war, right? Because it accompanied the Jewish people when they went to war and made them an unconquerable, unstoppable force. By the time of the war against Rome, at the end of the days of the Second Temple and beyond, they didn't have the Ark of the Covenant, right? The level of the people had fallen. They didn't have this, holy champion in God, accompanying the people to war. And that's why that war was not successful. Now, of course, it doesn't make sense that a people who are not the children of Israel could just seize the Ark of the Covenant and use it as a weapon. That would not work. And, well, see the movie. See the movie. Anyway, the Gemara now on Mishnah number 1. The Gemara clarifies an ambiguous point in the Mishnah. What is it saying when the Mishnah derives from the verse that the priest must address the people in Hebrew? Right? That's how we got to this. This is the connection to Sotah. And the Gemara answers, this is what the Mishnah is saying. The ruling is derived from a verbal analogy, as it is stated, quote, and speak, right? It says, and speak to the people. Vediber, right? Using the verb diber for speak, right? And speak, vediber. And there, concerning the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai, it says, Moses spoke and God answered him by a voice. Exodus 19:19. So just as there the voice spoke in the sacred tongue, God delivered the 10 Commandments in Hebrew, so too here the priest speaks in the sacred tongue. And the sages taught, the priest shall approach and speak to the people. Now, one might have thought that any priest would want to address one might have thought that any priest who would want to address the people may assume this role. To counter this idea, the verse states, and the officers shall speak. Officers. So just as the officers described are those who have been appointed to discharge their specific responsibilities, so too the priest being described here is one who has been appointed for this role. The Gemara asks, but if so, why not say that the high priest should deliver this address, as he is also appointed? And the Gemara replies, the appointed priest, meaning appointed for war, anointed for war, the appointed priest must be similar to an appointed officer. Just as an officer is one who has someone else, i.e., a judge with greater authority appointed above him, so too the priest described must be one who has someone else higher than him, i.e., the Kohen Gadol. Right? So at times of war, there would be two high priests. The high priest, who continues serving in the temple or in the tabernacle before the temple was built, and the high priest anointed for war, who goes to the battle. And the high priest anointed for war is only for that specific purpose, and he is considered to be lower in rank than the high priest who continues bringing the offerings on the altar. Now, the Gemara rejects this answer. The high priest also meets his qualification, as there is the king above him, and therefore the high priest should be the one who delivers this address to the troops. And the Gemara clarifies, the caveat that one must have someone appointed above him is saying someone above him in his function. That there is a king is irrelevant to the station of the high priest, as he ranks highest in the priesthood. So the Gemara suggests, well, then say it may be the deputy high priest, who is second to the high priest. He should deliver the address to the troops. And the Gemara answers, the deputy high priest is not an appointed office, as this position has no particular function except to be a ready substitute for the high priest. The deputy high priest is a sort of position of honor, and if something should happen to the high priest, particularly on Yom Kippur, okay, the deputy high priest is ready to step in and do the high priest job. But until that happens, the deputy high priest has no specific duties. As it is taught in a Baraisa, Rabbi Hanina, the deputy high priest, so Rabbi Hanina was a deputy high priest, says, to what end is the deputy appointed? It is merely for the possibility that if some disqualification befalls the high priest, the deputy steps in and serves in his stead. However, the deputy has no specific role of his own. Now, the Torah says about the priest anointed for war, and he shall say to them, hear Israel, Shema Yisrael. And the Gemara asks, what is different in this setting that necessitates the usage of the phrase Shema Yisrael? Right? Normally, Shema Yisrael is something we all say morning and evening as a prayer. Why is it that when the priest anointed for war addresses the nation, and specifically the troops that are going to war, why does he have to open his remarks with Shema Yisrael? Right now, he's addressing the whole nation, even though he's specifically standing before the troops. But he's addressing the whole nation. So Rabbi Yochanan said, in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, the Holy One, blessed be He, said to the Jewish people, even if you have not fulfilled any mitzvah except reciting Shema in the morning and in the evening, you will not be delivered into the hands of your enemies. As an allusion to this promise, the priest's address borrows the phrase, hear Israel, Shema Yisrael, a phrase most familiar from the beginning of the recitation of the Shema. How powerful is it that we say the Shema morning and evening? If all of us would do it, if the whole nation of Israel, or perhaps at least the majority of us would do it, nobody could defeat us. Sadly, so many Jews are now disconnected from Judaism. Please, God, help us reunite as a family under God and elevate our spiritual state. So at least the majority, if not all the Jews in the world would say Shema morning and evening, then nobody would be able to vanquish us. Now, with respect to the Mishna's comments about the verse, quote, let not your heart faint, fear not, nor be alarmed, and do not be terrified of them. Deuteronomy 20, verse 3. The sages taught in Tosefta 7:18, the priest speaks with them twice. One time when they are gathered at the border to leave the nation to go to battle, and when they are on the battlefield itself. When they are at the border, what does he say? Now we're on 42b. Says, so this is the priest talking. Hear my words, the regulations of war, and consider who is fit to participate in the battle. And return home, all of you who are exempt from combat. Who is not fit for battle? Go home. What does it mean to not be fit for battle? We'll come back to that. What does he say on the battlefield? Let not your heart faint, fear not, nor be alarmed, and do not be terrified of them. These 4 cautions correspond to 4 actions done by the nations of the world. They clash their weapons, they blast their horns, they shout, and they trample heavily with their horses to frighten their adversaries. Do not be afraid of any of these sounds. The Mishna recorded the particulars of the priest's address. The Philistines came championed by Goliath. Right? Earlier in the Mishnah it said that, well, the Philistines have Goliath, we have the Holy One above. What do we have to be afraid of, right? So the Mishnah said the Philistines came championed by Goliath. The Gemara describes the battle between David and Goliath. Now, what is implied by the name Goliath? Rabbi Yochanan says the verse indicates that he stood before the Holy One, blessed be he, with brazenness, gilui panim. As it is stated, quote, choose yourselves a man, ish, and let him come down to me, right? Goliath came out in front of the armies of Israel and said, choose for yourselves a man and let him come to me, right? He's a big macho giant of a soldier, confident that he could defeat anyone in one-on-one combat. And so he came out before the Jews, the children of Israel, who have God on their side, and nonetheless Goliath was brazen. Right? And he said, choose yourselves a man and let him come down to me. And another time Goliath said, quote, if he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then shall you be our servants and serve us. He was very confident. So there he supposed that his opponent would defeat him before supposing that he, Goliath, would be victorious. Right? He said, if I lose, we'll serve you, before he said, if I win, you will serve us. Right? So he spoke about himself losing before he spoke about himself winning. Maybe he was a little insecure. Finally, the other time that Goliath spoke like this was when he said to David, quote, am I a dog that you come to me with staves? And the Gemara asks, but didn't David also speak in this manner? David said to him, you come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin. And the Gemara answers, David then said to me immediately afterward, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted. Right? So David spoke bravely, courageously, sort of mocking his enemy, but he did so in the name of God. And he said, it's not because I'm great or strong. It's because I come, representing the children of Israel, who are championed by God. Now the verse says, quote, and the Philistine drew near morning and evening. Right? For 40 days, Goliath taunted. Nobody thought they could beat him in battle. So nobody stepped out of the lines to fight Goliath. So for 40 days, he came out and said, somebody come and fight me. And only finally then David emerged, right? And David was the least likely. He was not a large person. He was not an experienced soldier. He was a shepherd, right? As we know. So Rabbi Yochanan says, Goliath did this specifically in order to prevent them from completing the recitation of the Shema at the required times in morning and evening. So he came and said it right as they were praying Shema. Quote, and Goliath presented himself 40 days. And Rabbi Yochanan says these days correspond to the 40 days over which the Torah was given, right? When Moses was at the top of Mount Sinai receiving the Torah. And so Goliath wanted to overshadow the 40 days of Moses on Mount Sinai by taunting the armies of Israel for 40 days. Now the verse introduces Goliath. Quote, and a champion, an Ish Habenayim, went out from the camp of the Philistines named Goliath. 1 Samuel 17:4. And the Gemara asks, what is indicated by the term Benayim? And Rav said the word is related to the root bet nun hey, meaning build, right? Like God is the builder of Jerusalem, right? Bonei Yerushalayim. So it's related to this root that means build. and means that he, Goliath, built Muvnet perfectly and free of any blemish. And Shmuel said the word is related to the word Bain, meaning between, and it means that he was the middle among his brothers, Benoni. Goliath wasn't even the largest guy in his own family. Now, a sage from the school of Rabbi Shaila said the word is related to the root Beit Nun He, meaning build, and means that he was made strong as a building, binyan, right? So, like you can imagine, Goliath was like, compared to a skyscraper, to a large building. Now, Rabbi Yochanan said the word is related to the word Bain, meaning between, and it means that he was born from among many. As follows: he was the son of 100 fathers and one dog. Do you understand what he's saying? His mother, according to Rabbi Yochanan, the mother of Goliath, engaged in sexual intercourse with 100 men and a dog, and he was fathered from somewhere among them. No one knows who his father really was. Now, the verse recounts that he was named Goliath of Gath. And Rav Yosef taught this is because everyone would thresh his mother by cohabiting with her like people do in a wine press, a gat, where everyone tramples. And it is written that Goliath came from the caves, Me'arot, of the Philistines, but we read, according to the Masoretic text, he came from among, quote, the ranks, Ma'arkot, of the Philistines. And what is meant by the written term Me'arot? Rav Yosef taught the word is related to the word he'era, meaning penetrated, and it implies that everyone penetrated, he'eru, i.e. engaged in sexual intercourse with his mother. It is written that Goliath's mother was Harafa. Her name is given as Harafa, 2 Samuel 21:16. And in another place, it is written Orpah, right? That's from the book of Ruth, right? So we know that Ruth accompanied her mother-in-law, Naomi, right? Going back to Israel when Naomi returned after losing her husband and her 2 sons, right? So Ruth sticks with her mother-in-law, and Naomi's other daughter-in-law, Orpah, says she's going to stick with Naomi, but in the end, she goes back to her people and doesn't return to Israel with Naomi. Only Ruth does that. As a result of the events that we read in the book of Ruth, Ruth merited to join the Jewish people, and not only that, but she is the direct ancestor of King David, right? So Ruth joined the Jewish people, and from her would come King David. Orpah, right, her sister-in-law, said she was going to go with Naomi and then changed her mind. And now we're learning that this Orpah is actually Goliath's mother. Interesting. It is written Orpah, and the Gemara will soon explain that this was the same woman. Now, Rav and Shmuel engaged in a dispute concerning this matter. One of them said her name was Harafa. And why is she called by the name Orpah? It is because everyone came at her from behind. Orphan. Meaning that they sodomized her. And one of them said her name was Orpah. And why is it that they called her name Harafa? It is because everyone threshed her like groats, harifot, i.e. engaged in sexual intercourse with her. And so it says that this word means groats. Quote, and the woman took and spread the covering over the well's mouth and strewed groats, harifot, thereon. And if you wish, you can say from here, quote, through you should crush a fool in a mortar. Though you should crush a fool in a mortar with a pestle among groats, yet will not his foolishness depart from him. This is all by way of deriving that this woman who was either called Harafa and her nickname was Orpah, or she was named Orpah and her nickname was Harafa. And in either case, the nickname was earned because, she was a scandalous person sleeping around, and she's the mother of Goliath. Now the Gemara continues its discussion of the battle of David and Goliath. Now these 4 were born to Harafa in Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants, right? So not only Goliath was killed, but also his 3 brothers. And the Gemara asks, what are the names of the 4 siblings mentioned here? And Rav Chisda said they are Saf and Madon, Goliath, and Ishbi in Nob. And it says, quote, and they fell into the hands of David and his servants. Why? It is because of the acts of their forebears. As it is written, quote, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, and Ruth cleaved to her. Right? So in the book of Ruth, Orpah was also very close to Naomi, but only Ruth stayed with Naomi when Naomi returned to the land. Orpah left her behind and stayed with her people. And Rabbi Yitzchak says, the Holy One, blessed be he, said, the children of the one who kissed, referring to the 4 giants descended from Orpah, will come and fall into the hand of the children of the one who cleaved, referring to David, who was descended from Ruth. And Rava taught, as a reward for the 4 tears that Orpah shed in sadness over her mother-in-law, she merited to mother 4 mighty warriors. As it is stated, quote, and they lifted up their voice and wept again. Right, so Orpah wept. She cared about Naomi. She wanted to go with her, but it just, she didn't follow through. But because she had that intention and she really cared, she merited to mother these 4 tremendous warriors. Now, it is written about Goliath, quote, and the half of his spear was like a weaver's beam. And we read, according to the Masoretic tradition, and the shaft 8 of his spear. Rabbi Lazar says, the written version of the text demonstrates that we have not yet reached half, chetzi, of the praise of that wicked man. Only half of his spear was as long as a weaver's beam. But the Masoretic reading offers a less impressive description. It is learned from here that it is prohibited to relate the praise of wicked people. And the Gemara asks, if so, then the verse should not begin by praising him at all. And the Gemara answers, it was necessary in this case in order to relate the praise of David, who defeated Goliath. So we're only praising Goliath and saying how mighty and strong and fearsome he was, so that we understand what David was taking on when he went into single, man-to-man combat against Goliath. Now, according to the Mishna, back to the priest anointed for war, according to the Mishnah, the priest would say, the Ammonites came championed by Shobach. So in one account, but we are championed by God, right? So in one account, his name is written Shobach, 2 Samuel 10:18. And in another place in the Bible, it is written Shofach or Shopchach. Wait a minute. Another so in more, in a proper Hebrew pronunciation, Shoivach. And in another place, Shoifach, right? So is it Shoivach or Shoifach? That's the question. And Rav and Shmuel engaged in a dispute concerning this matter. One of them said his name was Shoifach. And why is he called by the name Shoivach? It is because he was built like a dovecote, as he was exceptionally tall. And one of them said his name was Shoivach. And why is he called by the name Shoifach? It is because anyone who would see him would become terrified and his courage would be spilled, nishpach, before him like from a jug. And the Gemara records a dispute concerning the enemy forces of Nebachadnezer, who would eventually destroy the first temple. Much later, right? David, in his youth, was long before the first temple was built. It was his son Solomon who would build the first temple. Now we skip forward some 450 years at least to the destruction of the first temple by Nebuchadnezzar. So the prophet states, their quiver, ashpato, is an open sepulcher, and they are all mighty men. That's Jeremiah 5:16. And Rav and Shmuel, and some say Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi, engaged in a dispute concerning the implication of the verse. One of them said, when they shoot an arrow, they produce heaps and heaps of corpses. Unless you say that they are skilled in the arts of battle, but they are not particularly strong, the verse states they are all mighty men. And one of them said, when they perform their needs, i.e. when they relieve themselves, they produce heaps and heaps, right? Ashpatot, of excrement, which indicates they eat heartily like mighty men. And lest you say it is because they are ill in their intestines, the verse states they are all mighty men. So either with regard to this army of Nebuchadnezzar, which are they produce heaps. Either it means they produce heaps of corpses or they produce heaps of number 2. Rab Mari said, learn from the exchange that if there is one whose excrement is abundant, he is ill in his intestines. The Gemara asks, what difference is there whether or not he is ill in his intestines? And the Gemara answers, it is so that one who suffers these symptoms will tend to himself medically. In a similar vein, and I am almost done, so if you've got questions or comments, get them in now. I have a little further to go. The Mishnah recounts the priest's address, but you are not like them. Wait, I'm sorry. In a similar vein, one is urged to relieve his distress. And the verse states, if there is a care in the heart of a man, let him bend it. Proverbs 12:25. And Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi dispute the verse's meaning. One said he should force it out of his mind. He shouldn't worry about it. And the other one said he should tell his troubles to others, which will relieve his anxiety. So interesting. What is better for someone to do who is really stressed out? Forget about it or talk it out, with somebody who is a sympathetic ear? We have two opinions on that. And the Mishnah recounts the priest's address, but you are not like them because, as the verse states, for the Lord your God is he that goes with you to fight for you against your enemies, to save you. And why does the verse elaborate so much in spelling out the nature of God's attendance in battle? Is because the ineffable name of God and all of his appellations that are written on the tablets was resting in the ark. And similarly, it says in the verse with regard to the war against Midian, and Moses sent them 1,000 of every tribe to the war, them and Pinchas the son of Elazar the priest to the war with the holy vessels and the trumpets for the alarm in his hand, Numbers 3:16. And the verse is interpreted as follows, them, these are the Sanhedrin, Pinchas, he was the priest anointed for war. And the holy vessels, this is the ark and the tablets that were within it. And the trumpets for the alarm, these are the shofars. And Atana taught it was not for nothing that specifically Pinchas went to war with Midian. Right now we're talking about the children of Israel in the wilderness, right, between Egypt and entering the promised land. And there was a war against the Midianites, right? Who was the priest at that time? The high priest? Aaron. Who was the priest anointed for war? His grandson, Pinchas. Right? So it was not for nothing that specifically Pinchas went to war with Midian. Rather, it was to exact the rightful judgment of his mother's father, Joseph, as it is stated, and the Midianites sold him into Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh's. And the Gemara asks, is this to say that Pinchas came on his mother's side from the family of Joseph? But it is written, and Elazar, Aaron's son, took himself a wife from the daughters of Putiel, and she bore him Pinchas. So what? Is it not that Pinchas came from the family of Yisro, right? Moses' father-in-law, who was also called Putiel because he fattened pitem, calves, for idol worship? And the answer is no. He was descended from Joseph, who mocked Pitpet, his desire, resisting the advances of Potiphar's wife. Now I'm almost done, so if you got questions or comments, get them in. And the Gemara asks, but is it not the case that, according to an oral tradition, the tribes were denigrating Pinchas after he killed Zimri? Right, in the incident where the Midianite women had seduced the men in the wilderness, and it caused a plague because they engaged in idol worship, and then this Zimri and Cosby, were actually like having sex openly in front of all the children of Israel in the desert, and Pinchas the zealot took a spear and killed them both, and that halted the plague. It actually saved many lives. So the Gemara asks, but is it not the case that, according to an oral tradition, the tribes were denigrating Pinchas after he killed Zimri, who was a chieftain of the tribe of Shimon, saying, did you see this son of Puti, the son whose mother's father fattened cows for idol worship? Should this man kill a prince of Israel? So evidently his grandfather Puti was Yisro, not Joseph. And so the Gemara answers, rather, Pinchas was descended from both Yosef and Yisro. If his mother's father descended from Yosef, right, from Joseph, so his mother's mother descended from Yisro. And if his mother's mother descended from Yosef, his mother's father descended from Yisro. His father descended from Aaron the Kohen. But his mother came from both Yisro and Yosef. And the Gemara confirms this resolution. The language is also precise as it is written. Elazar took a wife from the daughters of Putiel, which implies that she came from two daughters of men named Putiel. And the Gemara concludes, you may learn from the verse that this is so. And that actually concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 1 here in chapter 8 of Tractate Sotah, the 18th volume of the Talmud. Let us check questions or comments on what we've discussed here on page 42. Bill, I do know we have a different ordering of the minor prophets and we have different numbering of the Psalms, but there's also dispute among Christian traditions of how they are numbered too. The thing that leaps to mind immediately is that there's extensive debate in numbering parts of Exodus, specifically the Ten Commandments. I was referring to that the numbering of chapter and verse is a little bit different in the Jewish tradition and in others. Sharon, this is where the expression Chazak ve'emetz, be strong and have courage. This becomes the battle cry of the Israelites under Joshua and remains the motto now of the IDF, right? Be strong and have courage. We'll probably hear more about that. And Joseph says, a random fact that I learned is that Baal Peor, which was one of the gods, one of the idols that were worshipped by idolaters and is mentioned, I think, specifically in the Torah, Baal Peor, says Yosef, he learned that this was an excrement god and that people worship by relieving themselves by the idol. Just so, right? Can you imagine that there was a god, right? An idol that people worshipped in their foolishness, and the manner of worshiping that idol was to poop in front of it. I'm sorry. What kind of a relationship did they have with that particular deity? I don't know. At any rate, that's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow night when Shabbos ends for page 43. Shabbos ends later and later. I'll do my best to get on as soon as Shabbos ends here in LA. I'll probably get on the air by between 9 and 9:15 p.m. I really do my best to start as quickly as I can after Shabbos ends, but I have to walk home, from shul and the davening that we do at the end of Shabbos, etc. I try to get on early. I'm very mindful that the people on the East Coast, it's so late when we start the Saturday night class, but I'm very impressed with everyone who catches it live. All the best, my holy sisters and brothers, and may you have a wonderful, sweet, uplifting, peaceful, joy-drenched Shabbos.